holidays to those who celebrate that. Oops. Today we're doing the same daily routine we do every day. Meditation, reading, yoga, martial arts, and going for a run. Let's see, I'm going to start with a special song today. I don't know if it'll get taken down later. This is what I think of Thanksgiving.
Rightfully ours. Years from now, my people will be forced to live in mobile homes on reservations. Your people will wear cardigans and drink highballs. We will sell our bracelets by the roadsides. You will play golf and enjoy hot hors d'oeuvres. My people will have pain and degradation. Your people will have stick shifts. The gods of my tribe have spoken. They have said, do not trust the pilgrims. And for all these reasons, I've decided to scalp you and burn your village to the ground.
By the film industry, excuse me, and on television in movie reruns, and also with recent happenings at Wounded Knee.
We're taking the land which is rightfully ours. Years from now, my people will be forced to live in mobile homes on reservations. Your people will wear cardigans and drink highballs. We will sell our bracelets by the roadsides. You will play golf and enjoy hot hors d'oeuvres. My people will have pain and degradation. Your people will have stick shifts. The gods of my tribe have spoken. They have said, do not trust the pilgrims. And for all these reasons, I've decided to scalp you and burn your village to the ground.
natural or religious disaster. It's something, it's like genocide is what they for Indian people. So
Hundreds of indigenous women murdered or missing. A haunting national disgrace with no solution in sight.
How long has there been no water where you live?
For years. And all the springs, the spring water, they're dried out.
Sometimes they have to kill us. They have to kill us. Because they can't break our spirits.
It's 44 degrees and it's nice and rainy outside. But no one cares about that. It's not about the rain. It's what the rain represents. Life was always giving you a test. Trying to give you a way out. Trying to give you an excuse not to show up. This is my excuse today. But guess what? You gotta have the mentality to show up every fucking day of your life. No matter what life throws at you. It's our responsibility to show up to the Coliseum of life. Prepared for fucking battle. I don't care what you're going through, what life's throwing at you. It's your responsibility to find your new 100%. Take it upon yourself to do that. Stay hard. It's not about the rain. It's what the rain represents. Life is always giving you a test. Trying to give you a way out. It's not about the rain. It's what the rain represents. Life is always giving you a test. Trying to give you a way out. So what's your fucking excuse? Is it too cold where you live? Is it too hot where you live? Does it rain too fucking much? Now it's time for some real fucking talk. Maybe you're the only black person applying for a fucking job. Maybe you're the only female. Maybe you're the only fucking gay person. Job, whatever the fuck it may be. Maybe that sits in your fucking head. Maybe that's your excuse for not being better. Life's your own big fucking picture. When I was young, all those things got in my head. Black, fucking not smart enough, single mom, all that bullshit owns space in my head. If you're allowing people and things and situations to own space in your fucking head, you're losing. Last thing, life's one big fucking head game. You're playing with yourself. If you lose, it's because you allow life to get in your fucking head. Stay hard. It's not about the rain. It's what the rain represents. Life is always giving you a test. Trying to give you a way out. It's not about the rain. It's what the rain represents. Life is always giving you a test. Trying to give you a way out.
There's times where you're gonna have to do it alone. There's not gonna be any team support. There's not gonna be any family support. There's not gonna be any friend support. There's gonna be times where you've got to go and do it
dig deep yourself and get the job done. And if you can make that happen, you will win. And if you can make that happen, you will win. There's times where you're gonna have to do it alone. There's times where you're gonna have to do it alone. Let's think about those attributes that a warrior is supposed to have. Courage, self-confidence, self-discipline. What's interesting about those attributes is they're not inherited. They're not passed down in your genes. You don't get personal courage from your mom and dad. You don't get self-confidence from your genetic gene pool. And you damn sure don't get self-discipline in your bloodstream. These are choices that you make. You choose to be courageous. You choose to have confidence. And most important, you choose, you make the choice to be disciplined, to have self-discipline. You make the choice to be disciplined, to have self-discipline. There's times where you're gonna have to do it alone. There's times where you're gonna have to do it alone. So make the right choice by getting up every day and getting after it. Does discipline ever fail you? No. Actually, discipline does not fail me. I fail discipline. That's what happens on days where I veer off the path and onto the slippery slope of weakness. It isn't discipline's fault. It's my fault. I'm the one that's being weak. It's my fault. I'm the one that's not holding the line. I'm the one that is deciding to take the short-term gratification instead of the long-term domination. When I make that error, when I let discipline down, there's only one thing to do. And that's get back on the path. Get back on it. Get back on the path. Get back on it. Get back on the path. Get back on it. Step it up and go harder and push for it. Get back on the path. Get back on it. When laziness creeps in, it's not discipline that opened the door. It's me. It's me rationalizing and explaining and justifying that laziness. When I decide to take the easy path instead of the righteous path, That's all of it. It's me deciding to cave to my weaknesses and become a slave to them. And when I make that error, when I let discipline down, there's only one thing to do. Get back on it. Get back on the path. Get back on it. Get back on the path. Get back on it. Step it up and go harder and push for me. Get back on the path. Get back on it. For your transgressions. Cleanse yourself in the fire and the suffering of the discipline and get back on the path. The hard, unrelenting path of discipline. That path that leads to freedom.
Jocko, focus in a battle is easy. How do you keep focus in a long war?
Akira. Well, that can definitely be true. It can be pretty easy to focus on the battle that's right in front of your face. And when you're doing that, sometimes you can lose track of the long-term goal. The long-term goal. The long-term goal. Make it happen. Make it happen. The long-term goal. The long-term goal. Never lose sight of it. Ever. I want to have that long-term goal so embedded in my mind that I never lose sight of it. Ever. And those little tasks and projects and short-term goals that you tackle, they need to lead toward that strategic victory. Winning the long war. The long-term goal. The long-term goal. Make it happen. Make it happen. The long-term goal. The long-term goal. Never lose sight of it. Ever. And we get very caught up in instant gratification. We want results now. We want the shortcut to the winner's podium. And sometimes, when we don't get that short-term glory that we want, we lose track of those long-term goals. And you look up in 6 weeks, or in 6 months, or in 6 years, and you've made no progress. None. You never moved. You might even be further from your goal than you were. Why? Why did you let that happen? It's because you lost sight of that. The long-term goal. Make it happen. Make it happen. The long-term goal. The long-term goal. Never lose sight of it. Ever.
some point, after you lose sight of that goal and years have gone by, you think to yourself, maybe I can't. Maybe I can't do it. And so you give up. You let it fade. And you settle. You settle for mediocrity. You settle for average. You settle for, oh well. But no. Don't do that. Embed that long-term goal in your mind. Burn it into your soul. Think about it, write about it, talk about it, hang it up on your wall. But most important, do something about it. Do something about it every day. Do something that moves you toward that goal, that keeps the goal alive and in sight and in focus. However small or insignificant that step might seem, take it to it. Do that little piece. Make it happen. Make it happen. Because that goal isn't going to achieve itself. It's all on you.
I see your talents have gone beyond the mere physical level. Your skills are now at the point of spiritual insight. What is the highest technique you hope to achieve?
To have no technique. To have no technique.
Very good. What are your thoughts when facing an opponent?
There is no opponent. Because the word I does not exist. It does not exist. There is no opponent. Because the word I does not exist. It does not exist. A good fight should be like a small play, but played seriously. A good martial artist does not become tense, but ready. Ready. Not thinking yet, not dreaming. Ready for whatever may come. There is no opponent. Because the word I does not exist. It does not exist. There is no opponent. Because the word I does not exist. It does not exist. When the opponent expands, I contract. When it contracts, I expand. And when there is an opportunity, I do not hit. It hits all by itself. It hits all by itself. It hits all by itself. It hits all by itself.
Jocko, I am a chronic excuse maker. How do I stop making excuses and get things done? Chronic excuse maker. How do you stop making excuses? This is actually Pretty simple. And I said it the other day, you have to realize, you have to know, you have to accept that all your excuses are lies. All your excuses are lies. Think about the lies you use to rationalize taking the easy road. Taking the easy road and leaving discipline behind. Your excuses are lies. Think about them. You don't have time. That's a lie. You don't have support. That's a lie. You don't have the equipment or the gear. Lies. You don't know the best way. Who cares? That's a lie. Or you're too old, or you're too young. Of course you're too old or too young. Lie. And there's you're too busy. Sure you are. That's a lie. Your excuses are lies. Your excuses are lies. Think about the lies you use to rationalize taking the easy road. Taking the easy road and leaving discipline behind. Your excuses are lies. And you're too tired, or you're too sore, or you're just plain not feeling it. Lies, lies, lies. And the list goes on and on and on. And it doesn't stop if you don't make it stop. So recognize the excuses are not valid. They aren't. They're trumped up. They're conjured up. They're fabricated. They're lies. Your excuses are lies. Your excuses are lies. Think about the lies you use to rationalize taking the easy road. Taking the easy road and leaving discipline behind. Your excuses are lies. And how do you stop the lies? You stop the lies with the truth. The truth. The truth will set you free. The truth will stand, and the truth will deliver you from procrastination and laziness and the downward spiral that comes with a lack of discipline. So, don't believe the lies, believe the truth. But the truth is, you have time. You have the skill. You have the knowledge and the support and the willpower and the discipline to get it done. So, cast out the lies, burn them down, and listen to the truth. Then live the truth and go out and get it done. So I wake up early. I wake up at 4:45. I like to have that psychological win over the enemy. The enemy. When I wake up in the morning and I don't know why, I'm thinking about the enemy. And what they're doing. And I a very dark place. It's a dark place. That's what war is. War is. War is. War is. War is. The enemy. The enemy. When I wake up in the morning and I don't know why, I'm thinking about the enemy. When your job, which my job was to expand that darkness in many ways. I mean, the war is about killing people. And so for me, when I look to someone that's successful, it's someone that brings some light into that darkness. That darkness, 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 darkness. The first people that come to my head are Mark Lee, who is one of my guys, first SEAL killed in Iraq. Mike Mansour, one of my guys, second SEAL killed in Iraq. And Ryan Job, one of my guys, wounded in Iraq, blinded in both eyes, made it home, married his high school sweetheart, got her pregnant, finished his college degree, and after his 22nd service. What motivates me?
It's 44 degrees and it's nice and rainy outside. But no one cares about that. It's not about the rain. It's what the rain represents. Life was always giving you a test. Trying to give you a way out. Trying to give you an excuse not to show up. This is my excuse today. But guess what? You gotta have the mentality to show up every fucking day of your life. No matter what life throws at you. It's our responsibility to show up to the Coliseum of life. Prepared for fucking battle. I don't care what you're going through, what life's throwing at you. It's your responsibility to find your new 100%. Take it upon yourself to do that. Stay hard. It's not about the rain. It's what the rain represents. Life was always giving you a test. Trying to give you a way out. It's not about the rain. It's what the rain represents. Life was always giving you a test. Trying to give you a way out. So what's your fucking excuse? Is it too cold where you live? Is it too hot where you live? Does it rain too fucking much? Now it's time for some real fucking talk. Maybe you're the only black person applying for a fucking job. Maybe you're the only female. Maybe you're the only fucking gay person. Job, whatever the fuck it may be. Maybe that sits in your fucking head. Maybe that's your excuse for not being better. Life's a real big fucking picture. When I was young, all those things got in my head. Black, fucking not smart enough, single mom, all that bullshit owns space in my head. If you're allowing people and things and situations to own space in your fucking head, you're losing. Last thing, life's one big fucking head game. You play with yourself. If you lose, it's because you allow life to get in your fucking head. Stay hard. It's not about the rain. It's what the rain represents. Life was always giving you a test. Trying to give you a way out. It's not about the rain. It's what the rain represents. Life was always giving you a test. Trying to give you a way out.
There's times where you're gonna have to do it alone. There's not gonna be any team support. There's not gonna be any family support. There's not gonna be any friend support. There's gonna be times where you've got to go and do it yourself when you gotta do it alone. And those are the times that make a difference. Those are the times that count. Those are the times where you have to dig deep yourself to get the job done. And if you can make that happen, you will win. And if you can make that happen, you will win. There's times where you're gonna have to do it alone. There's times where you're gonna have to do it alone. Let's think about those attributes that a warrior is supposed to have. Courage, self-confidence, self-discipline. What's interesting about those attributes is they're not inherited. They're not passed down in your genes. You don't get personal courage from your mom and dad. You don't get self-confidence from your genetic gene pool. And you damn sure don't get self-discipline in your bloodstream. These are choices that you make. You choose to be courageous. You choose to have confidence. And most important, you choose. You make the choice to be disciplined, to have self-discipline. You make the choice to be disciplined, to have self-discipline. There's times where you're gonna have to do it alone. There's times where you're gonna have to do it alone. So make the right choice by getting up every day and getting after it. Does discipline ever fail you? No. Actually, discipline does not fail me. I fail discipline. That's what happens on days where I veer off the path and onto the slippery slope of weakness. It isn't discipline's fault. It's my fault. I'm the one that's being weak. It's my fault. I'm the one that's not holding the line. I'm the one that is deciding to take the short-term gratification instead of the long-term domination. When I make that error, when I let discipline down, there's only one thing to do. And that's get back on the path. Get back on it. Get back on the path. Get back on it. Get back on the path. Get back on it. Step it up and go harder and push for That's all on me. That's all on me. It's me deciding to cave to my weaknesses and become a slave to them. And when I make that error, when I let discipline down, there's only one thing to do. Get back on the path. Get back on the path. Get back on it. Step it up and go harder and push for me. Get back on the path. Get back on it. For your transgressions. Cleanse yourself in the fire and the suffering of the discipline and get back on the path. The hard, unrelenting path of discipline. That path that leads to freedom.
So it's been about 30 minutes sitting. I like to meditate on things like this instead of just sitting and doing nothing useful. Or I'll play an audiobook in the background. So after we sit for 30 minutes, we read for 30 minutes. I'm going to be reading out loud from the Revolutionary Communists of America newspaper. Excuse me. I'll bring this in so you can hear me better. We just sat for 30 minutes meditating. Now we're going to read for 30 minutes. So this article is called Cockroaches and Zombies, the Debt-Fueled Nightmare Keeping Capitalists Up at Night by Abit Paul in Queens, New York. Last year, corporate America amassed record-breaking profits of $4 trillion. This year, the stock market hit multiple record highs. As a result, the capitalists paraded the alleged resilience of the U.S. economy. However, last month, symptoms of a deep systemic illness began to bubble to the surface. Yeah, like 25% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. Tricolor, a subprime auto lender that preyed on undocumented immigrants and low-income workers, loaned more than $1 billion last year and went bankrupt in last September. 3 weeks later, the auto parts supplier First Brands also filed for bankruptcy. After amassing mind-boggling levels of debt, First Brands would have to sell off their assets 50 times over to reach solvency. These aren't one-off situations, and the financial press is sounding the alarm. Jamie Dimon, CEO of JP Morgan Chase, put it aptly. When you see one cockroach, there are probably more. Everyone should be forewarned on this one. Beneath the surface, the economy rests on an incredibly weak foundation of speculation and debt. Zombie companies. According to the Associated Press, in 2023, out of 5,000 publicly traded companies, 40% were found to be zombies. Unprofitable entities with barely enough revenue to service their debt. These companies' business model is built on parasitically feeding off cheap debt, using it to inflate the value of their own stock. Last year, 23,107 companies filed for bankruptcy, a 70% increase since 2022. According to Moody's, the average risk default for U.S. public companies reached 9.2% at the end of 2024, with no clear signs that things have peaked. These zombie companies employ 130 million workers worldwide, and their livelihoods are on the line if their bosses default. Whatever ghoulish term the financial bourgeoisie uses, these cockroaches and zombies are the natural spawn of nearly 2 decades of ultra-cheap borrowing. They are the first signs of the hangover from the cheap credit rager that followed 2008. You've got to get up and dance. After the 2008 meltdown, the capitalists pumped the banks full of cheap credit. They hoped this would reignite the economy and stave off an explosion of open class struggle. The problem is that debt eventually has to be paid back with interest. The anemic post-2008 recovery was the result of a capitalist class that had become dependent on cheap credit and speculation. Still, corporations took advantage of low borrowing costs, showering themselves with cash. In 2008, the CEO of Citi, Chuck Prince, said, "As long as the music is playing, you've got to get up and dance." In other words, as long as there's profit to be made in lending, the banks will keep on partying. At the height of the financial debacle of 2008, overall corporate debt was nearly $7 trillion. It has since doubled to $14.1 trillion. On the consumer side, the average of subprime borrowers who are at least 60 days late on their car loans has doubled since 2021, worse than the past 3 recessions. This would be bad enough, but banks aren't the only ones lending. Private creditors such as Blackstone got in on the frenzy. If a corporation was too risky to be lent to, they could go to a non-bank private lender. Tricolor was one of these shady creditors. Private credit has grown from $300 billion in 2010 to $1.8 trillion today. The explosive growth of private lending is alarming economists. Kristalina Georgieva, the head of the IMF, said that the risk of the private credit market keeps me awake at night. The entire world economy is being fueled by an exorbitant and growing amount of debt that cannot be paid off. The music is coming to a screeching halt. By trying to solve the nightmare of 2008, capitalists have kicked the can down the road and planted the seeds of a much larger crisis. The music stops. What then? When the next crisis materializes, the system will demand its pound of flesh. Someone will have to pay, and it won't be the capitalists. If the coming market crash is on the scale of the dot-com correction, millions will lose their jobs and find themselves plunged into poverty. Hunger and homelessness will skyrocket, and massive cuts to social spending will ensue. In 2008, the bailouts allowed the capitalists to avoid the worst effects of a head-on confrontation with the working class. The working class paid mainly through the attrition of inflation, which is more subtle than direct wage cuts and mass austerity, although there was plenty of that too. In 2008, the world capitalist class was relatively united. Today, the world situation is defined by deep rifts, both between and within the national capitalist classes. They cannot avoid the social fallout. Millions more will be radicalized. The perspective is for open class warfare in the coming period. We must urgently build the necessary leadership to prepare for this. U.S. economy propped up by volatile tech bubble. Chase, Birkland, Los Angeles, California. The ruling class is increasingly gripped with panic over the prospect of an impending stock market crash. This stuff might sound boring, but if you don't think politics and economics are related to you, or you're just not interested in politics, I guarantee you there was a bunch of civilians in Nagasaki and Hiroshima in Japan who were also not interested in politics until a thermonuclear weapon exploded over their city and vaporized about 1 million people altogether. The former chief economist at the IMF has warned that the coming correction could sink the world economy into a major slump, evaporating as much as 35 trillion in one fell swoop. Rallies on the market have allowed the richest 10%, who own 85% of all stocks, to increase their wealth as the market has hit one record after another. But the boom hides the rot in the real economy. The capitalists are now fearful that the speculative AI bonanza that has buoyed their wealth is coming to an end. Mother of all bubbles. Geeta Gopinath, Deputy Managing Director of the IMF until September, estimates a crash could wipe out over $20 trillion in wealth for American households, equivalent to roughly 70% of American GDP in 2024. This is several times larger than the losses incurred during the dot-com crash of the early 2000s. That would eliminate more wealth than the total owned by the bottom 80% of households. Such a crisis would send shockwaves through the world economy. Foreign investors have pumped their idle cash into the mushrooming U.S. market to get in on the action, inflating the bubble further. Because of the scale of exposure, she predicts they could face wealth losses exceeding 15 trillion, or about 20% of the rest of the world's GDP. The tech stock frenzy made up 80% of the market's gains this year. According to one Harvard economist, investment in tech accounted for a whopping 92% of GDP growth in the first half of the year. Without this, the U.S. economy would have expanded by a paltry 1%. Such concentration of speculative capital, when 95% of AI companies building it haven't turned a profit, it is a clear sign of a bubble. Two tech firms driving the market have stock valuations dramatically exceeding their actual earnings. Just before the dot-com bubble popped in the early 2000s, the average stock price in the S&P 500 was 44 times higher than actual earnings. Today, the average stock is priced at 40 times earnings, higher than just before the 1929 crash. Nvidia is trading at 60 times its earnings, Tesla at 240 times, and Palantir at an astronomical 700 times. So these are indicators of things that happen right before a crash, right before another Great Depression, right? Another flashing red light is the increasing in debt, margin debt, money borrowed solely for stock market speculation. Such debt has grown by 32% between May and September to $1.3 trillion, just below the rate in the run-up to the dot-com crash. If the market plummets, investors relying on margin debt will scramble to pay it back with interest, causing panic and a collapse in the credit market, tanking firms that rely on debt to remain afloat. Circular financing. Of course, tech giants and their financiers claim that comparisons to the dot-com bubble are unsound, pointing to the high levels of investment in tech infrastructure today. Companies are on track to spend $400 billion this year on AI, and the Financial Times estimates spending could top $7 trillion by 2030. While this investment is significant, with such a frail economy outside the AI ecosystem, where is consumer demand for their services going to come from? Pulling back the curtain reveals demand is largely created by so-called circular financing. In essence, sellers are artificially generating demand by investing in their buyers, spinning a complex and opaque web of cross-holdings throughout the AI supply chain. Many large tech firms invest in, quote, special purpose vehicles to disguise the cost of their AI build-out, removing it from their own balance sheets. Moreover, they're increasingly partnering with private creditors and tapping shadow banks for less regulated funding, making bourgeois analysts nervous. Because OpenAI loses money each year, Nvidia has announced mass investments in OpenAI so the latter can buy NVIDIA's chips. Both firms invested in CoreWeave, which will provide data center servers equipped with NVIDIA's chips to run OpenAI models. OpenAI has similar mutual investment deals with Microsoft and AMD. And NVIDIA doesn't even make the best chips for this kind of thing. Oracle's share price jumped by 25% after committing hundreds of billions in deals with OpenAI. In order to finance this, one analyst noted, Oracle will have to take on a sensational amount of debt. Together, AI companies have amassed $1.2 trillion in debt. Capitalism at a dead end. Behind the stock market mirage and the frenzied competition to build out AI infrastructure lies a capitalist system in terminal decline. Worldwide overproduction means more corporate cash flows into speculation instead of production. Nearly 1 million fewer jobs are added this year than initially reported, and layoffs hit a rate not seen since 2020. The housing market is in a slump as prices continue to rise despite weak demand. Delinquencies on credit cards and auto loans are climbing rapidly. The richest 10% make up 50% of all consumer spending. If their stock holdings nosedive, so too will their spending, sending the borrowing economy into recession or worse. The strategists of capital are awakening to the fact that this crash will be more than an ephemeral, quote, market correction. The profit-driven logic of capitalism forces the capitalists to throw their money into the market despite the volatility. Though it's impossible to predict which straw will break the camel's back, it's clear this carousel of speculation will eventually spin off its axis and crash. When it does, the ruling class will try to make the workers pay, leading to colossal explosions of class struggle. Trade War Shows U.S. Capitalism's Decline by Erica Rodell, Brooklyn, New York. 9 months of the U.S.-China trade war has conclusively proved that China has more leverage over the U.S. than the U.S. has over its rival. At every step of the negotiations, Trump has been the one to climb down, exposing the hollowness of his threats and bluster. The reason is simple. China has achieved dominance in a whole host of advanced manufacturing and technology supply chains. As a result, it is Xi Jinping who holds the trump cards. Imperialist hypocrisy. In the lead-up to the last round of talks, alarms sounded in the West over China's moves to block the export of critical rare earth minerals. U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer accused China of, quote, economic coercion to influence American politics. In response to Trump's 30% tariffs and a $50 increase in port fees, China stopped buying, I think that means to say 50%. China stopped buying soybeans from the U.S., knowing this would hurt Trump's base. Politico accused China of, quote, weaponizing ag imports to target Trump and U.S. farmers. All wars, including trade wars, are justified as wars of defense, but the U.S. accusing China of, quote, weaponizing global supply chains is the pot calling the kettle black. U.S. imperialism has long used sanctions, embargoes, and export restrictions to enforce its interests against any country that defends its rules-based order. Not only has it weaponized trade against countries like Russia and Cuba, but also against its, quote, allies. In the Suez Canal crisis in 1956, President Eisenhower threatened to crash the British economy with a sell-off of sterling bonds and an embargo on future loans if they didn't fall in line. Weaponizing trade is fine, as long as they are the ones doing it. The issue at the heart of the trade war is that China's economy has grown too big to push around. China's leverage. China has spent the last 35 years building up a robust vertical monopoly in rare earth minerals. It now controls 70% of all rare earth mining, 90% of all refinement, and manufactures 93% of the world's magnets. Rare earths are critical to the communications, transportation, energy, and military industries. In fact, all modern technology depends on these materials. The U.S. cannot afford to walk away from this supply chain without plunging American industry into catastrophe. The U.S. has been depleting its weapons stores via Ukraine and Israel, and rare earth minerals are key to building them back up. China's monopoly on rare earths is therefore seen as a threat, not only to the broader economy, but to the future of the U.S. military. Why did the U.S. fall behind? Contrary to their name, rare earth minerals are abundant around the globe. Mining and basic refinement techniques are not trademark secrets. U.S. capital has had every opportunity to invest in this industry. They didn't do it for a simple reason: the profit motive. New industries require big investments and entail many risks. It can take up to 20 years to build a new mineral mine, and 10 to 20 to build refinement and manufacturing plants. It can take years, if not decades, for the profits to roll in. So even if U.S. companies made the necessary rare earth processing investments today, U.S. imperialism would still be dependent on China for the foreseeable future. World trade takes a detour. In response to the tariff chaos, many countries are opting for closer trade relations with China and are distancing themselves from the U.S. market. Chinese exports to Southeast Asia and the EU have already offset the fall in its exports to the U.S. Chinese exports to Brazil grew 23% last year, and the country is now China's go-to source for soybeans. China's trade with Africa has jumped 26% since the start of 2025 alone. Even Canada, hit with U.S. tariffs on steel, auto, and lumber products, is exploring deeper trade partnerships with India and China. World trade relations are being renegotiated, but not to the U.S.'s advantage. As Trump had hoped, the tariffs have only exposed the continued decline and isolation of U.S. imperialism. Trump's latest threat to impose 100% tariffs on China on top of the 30% already in place is just another taco. Trump always chickens out moment. And it looks like another video just dropped on the Revolutionary Communists International, so check them out. Please like, share, and subscribe. China accounts for 19.6% of world GDP, up 1.8% in 1990, and it is still growing at a rate of nearly 5% annually. By comparison, the U.S. share of world GDP has stagnated at 26% for the last 35 years. Xi will want negotiations with Trump to reflect the new economic balance of forces. The working class loses. Far from reshoring jobs to the U.S., companies have responded with tariffs and price hikes, supply chain swaps, and mass layoffs. The U.S. has shed 89,000 manufacturing jobs so far this year. Apple is moving its production to India, and Hasbro has changed two suppliers in Turkey. UPS used the tariffs to justify tens of thousands of layoffs. Companies stockpiled inventory before the tariffs hit, hoping to ride out the storm. But just as the stocks are depleted, more price hikes are on the horizon, just in time for the holidays. The 2024 elections were a referendum on Biden and the economy. Trump promised he was going to, quote, fix everything in this country, and championed tariffs as the key to the new golden age. In the span of 9 months, he has failed to deliver. By any metric, inflation increased by another 3%, and the jobs report have been so dismal that Trump fired the chief of labor statistics for delivering the bad news. This is preparing another shift in consciousness as the working class looks for a way out of the dead end of capitalism. Grocery inflation gnawing at workers' wallets. Nick Brancasio in Phoenix, Arizona. As ruling class bloodsuckers feed on our immiseration, trips to aisle 4 have become extra painful for workers. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, Oh, hey, Tati, could you please toss all the Thanksgiving leftovers in that toaster oven? So they're like hot when I'm done with the workout? Yeah. Thank you so much. I appreciate you. Love you. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, grocery prices rose nearly 30% between February 2020 and September 2025. Meanwhile, real wages have declined by 7% between 2021 and 2025. The bourgeois press points to conjunctural factors to explain why workers have to eat these prices. The Ukraine war, avian flu, Trump's tariffs, but ultimately, this is another expression of capitalism's rot. Trump promised to slash inflation, which saw food prices climb as high as 11.4% in 2022. Although the administration boasts that egg prices are down 80% as of October, workers aren't celebrating. According to the Harris poll, only 1 in 5 Americans say it's now easier to afford groceries. 65% say they are financially squeezed month to month. I recently started using Cash App to take out a loan because I don't have enough money before payday, and then I have to pay that loan back. I take out about $150 like a day or two before payday because I'm just out of food, right? Another poll by the Associated Press and NORC found that the cost of groceries is a major source of stress for just over half of Americans, greater than rent, healthcare, and student debt. In Philadelphia, according to Consumer Affairs, a typical family of 4 now spends $645 more on their grocery cart annually than a year ago. Considering that last year, some 40% of Americans reported needing a loan to make their ends meet, this kitchen-to-table stress is no surprise. Beef, in particular, has broken records month after month. In August, a pound of ground beef hit a national average of $6.32, a 51% increase since February 2020, and a 12.8% jump since last October. Why? A perfect storm of supply and demand. U.S. beef cattle herds are at the largest levels since the 1960s, largely due to a climate-driven drought. U.S. beef cattle herds are at the lowest levels since the 1960s, largely due to a climate-driven drought that has plagued the Great Plains since 2021. Less feed means ranchers are selling female stock young in order to keep down costs on alternative feed, resulting in fewer calves. 2 additional factors have exacerbated the situation in 2025. An outbreak of a parasite called New World Screwworm in Mexico and Trump's tariffs. As of August, the latter hit the U.S. largest sources of imported beef, Brazil. Until recently, Brazil accounted for a quarter of the world's beef exports. After Trump raised tariffs on Brazilian beef to 76.4%, its shipments tumbled by 41% in September. A similar picture emerges for coffee, which saw a 20% price hike in the last year. Which countries export the most coffee to the U.S.? Colombia and Brazil, both of which Trump has attempted to bully with tariffs, 10% and 50% respectively. to push back against South America's largest trading partner, China. The list of year-on-year price hikes goes on and on. Bananas are up 6.6%, pet food 8.2%, infant formula 17.5%. Both Kroger and Albertsons are reporting reduced sales. To top it off, the government shutdown threatens 42 million Americans' access to SNAP benefits, which have since been cut off by Trump. While shoppers are forced to pass on, quote, luxuries like meat and fresh produce, demand for recession foods is rising. Hamburger helper sales jumped nearly 15% this year, and sales are up for beans, rice, canned tuna, and mac and cheese. The world produces enough to feed 10 billion people, but 11% worldwide go hungry. Supply and demand appears as an alien force because the anarchy of the market constrains global agriculture's potential superabundance. Under a rational, democratically planned economy, irrational food prices would become a thing of the past. However, so long as capitalism manages agriculture, the working class can't even afford the sacrificial calves piling up in the meat department. MAGA fractures as GOP voters turn on Trump, by Owen Fennerton, Minneapolis, Minnesota. As Trump attempts to manage the decline of U.S. imperialism on the world stage through trade war escalations, some of his most loyal supporters are paying the price and are beginning to turn on him. Trump's approval is now underwater in 12 states he won in 2024, including all 7 swing states. The sharpest drop has been among the youth. 30% of Trump voters under 35 no longer support him, according to Pew Research. He hasn't kept his promises, said Angel Castaneda, member of the Young Conservatives at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania, speaking to the Financial Times. He started a tariff war and now prices are going up. The government shutdown is stupid. I don't know what he's doing. I'm very close to calling myself an independent. End quote. U.S. farmers are among those having second thoughts. Trump's trade war with China has collapsed the soybean market, leaving farmers with shrinking revenues, ballooning debt, and no choice but to take out even more loans. Farm bankruptcies jumped by 57% in the first half of the year, and I don't think they're mentioning farmer suicides here. 2025 saw an increase in farmer suicides. My bad. Which are already 3.5 times higher than the general population. This is a man-made disaster caused by Donald Trump and his administration, said one Iowa soybean farmer. Coal miners, who once saw Trump as their defender, are also suffering. Although Trump pledged $625 million in subsidies and 13 million acres of federal land to help coal capitalists, he has slashed environmental regulations and stalled the enforcement of exposure limits on carcinogenic silica dust. Corporations get handouts, while miners get black lung. The irreversible disease has seen a re-emergence due to new mining practices which produce more silica dust, shortening life expectancy by 12.6 years on average. So my family came from Pennsylvania on my dad's side, and whenever any of them would start coughing, they would say things like, "Damn the mines," because it doesn't just make the miners sick, it makes everyone in that community around the mine sick as well. Quote, "The coal miners have supplied this country with electricity and now they're just cast aside to die," said Judith Rafe, whose husband died of black lung. Retired miner Gary Hairston said, "The companies might be getting a handout, but the miners aren't getting none." As a result, this once reliable MAGA layer now gathers in front of the Labor Department protesting the Trump administration. Military veterans have also undergone a shift. Although 65% of vets backed Trump in the election, 76% of them opposed DOJ firings of VA staff. Veterans make up 30% of civilian federal workers who are suffering the consequences of the latest government shutdown. After mixing paychecks, veterans and military families now line up at food banks. A viral clip of soldiers standing in line for hours to feed their families prompted comments such as, "America being great again," and this is quite literally Donald Trump's America. As MAGA fractures, an opportunity opens for genuine working class movement armed with a socialist program. So I'll wrap up reading there. And now we're going to jump into the yoga for 30 minutes. Excuse me, buddy. It's time to move. And then we're going to do a martial arts and fitness workout for 30 minutes. And now we're going to listen. Hey, move, buddy. Move your butt. It's gross. Come on. Now we're going to listen to Lenin. I've been studying the Russian Revolution, and specifically all the works of Lenin, because he wrote a lot.
Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the September 2021 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of The Collapse of the Second International by Lenin from 1915. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting us on Patreon. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So this text is the 11th in the basic Marxism-Leninism study guide that we are doing here on the channel, the curriculum for which comes from the MAI, or Movimiento Antiimperialista, anti-imperialism movement. I'll put a link to that playlist of videos in the video description. So, this was written in the second half of May and the first half of June 1915. This is, of course, about 2 years before the 1917 October Revolution, in which the communists took power in Russia. It was published in 1915 in the journal Communiste, numbers 1 and 2. It was signed N. Lenin, published according to the text in that journal. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1974, Moscow, Volume 21. Thanks, as usual, to the Marxists Internet Archive at Marxists.org. Please go check them out. MIA hosts thousands of free Marxist texts. Please go make use of this excellent resource. So, let's get into the audiobook. The collapse of the International is sometimes taken to mean simply the formal aspect of the matter, namely, the interruption in international communication between the socialist parties of the belligerent countries, the impossibility of converting either an international conference or the International Socialist Bureau, etc. This is the point of view held by certain socialists in the small neutral countries, probably even by the majority of the official parties in those countries, and also by the opportunists and their defenders. With a frankness that deserves profound gratitude, this position was defended in the Russian press by Mr. V. Kosovsky, number 8 of the Bund's Information Bulletin, whose editors said nothing to indicate that they disagreed with the author. Let us hope that Mr. Kosovsky's defense of nationalism, in which he went so far as to justify the German Social Democrats who voted for war credits, will help many a worker at last to realize the bourgeois nationalist character of the Bund. To the class-conscious workers, socialism is a serious conviction, not a convenient screen to conceal petty bourgeois conciliatory and nationalist oppositional strivings. By the collapse of the International, they understand the disgraceful treachery to their convictions which was displayed by most of the official social democratic parties, treachery to the most solemn declarations in their speeches at the Stuttgart and Basel international congresses, and in the resolutions of these congresses, etc. Only those can fail to see this treachery who do not wish to do so, or do not find it to their advantage to see it. If we would formulate the question in a scientific fashion, i.e. from the standpoint of class relations in modern society, we will have to state that most of the social democratic parties, and at their head, the German party first and foremost, the biggest and most influential party in the Second International, have taken sides with their general staffs, their governments, and their bourgeoisie against the proletariat. This is an event of historic importance, one that calls for a most comprehensive analysis. It has long been conceded that, for all the horror and misery they entail, wars bring at least the following more or less important benefit. They ruthlessly reveal, unmask, and destroy much that is corrupt, outworn, and dead in human institutions. The European War of 1914 to 15 is doubtlessly beginning to do some good by revealing to the advanced class of the civilized countries what a foul and festering abscess has developed within its parties, and what an unbearably putrid stench comes from some source. Section 1. Is it a fact that the principal socialist parties of Europe have forsaken all their convictions and tasks? This, of course, is something that is readily discussed neither by the traitors nor those who are fully aware or surmise that they will have to be friendly and tolerant towards them. However unpleasant that may be to various authorities in the Second International or to their fellow thinkers among the Russian Social Democrats, we must face the facts and call things by their right names. We must tell workers the truth. Do any facts exist that show how the socialist parties regarded their tasks and their tactics before the present war and in anticipation of it? They undoubtedly do. There was the resolution adopted at the Basel International Socialist Congress of 1912, which we are reprinting together with the resolution adopted at the Chemnitz Congress of the German Social Democratic Party, held in the same year, as a reminder of socialism's forgotten ideals. Quick note, you can find an audiobook of the Basel Resolution or the Basel Manifesto here at Socialism for All. There's also a footnote there on the Chemnitz Congress of the German Social Democratic Party. This was held on September 15 to 21st, 1912, and it passed a resolution titled On Imperialism, which said that the imperialist states were pursuing, quote, a policy of shameless plunder and annexations, and called upon the party, quote, to fight imperialism with greater energy. During World War I, leaders of the Second International treacherously violated the decisions of the International Socialist Congresses, in particular this one. Back to the main text. This resolution, which summarizes the vast anti-war propagandist and agitational literature in all countries, is a most complete and precise, a most solemn and formal exposition of socialist views on war and tactics towards war. One cannot but qualify as treachery the fact that none of the authorities of yesterday's international and of today's social chauvinism, neither Heinemann and Gesda nor Kautsky and Plekhanov, dare remind their readers of that resolution. They are either silent about it or, like Kautsky, quote excerpts of secondary importance and evade everything that is really of significance. On the one hand, the most left and arch-revolutionary resolutions, and on the other, the most shameless forgetfulness or renunciation of these resolutions. This is one of the most striking manifestations of the International's collapse, and at the same time, a most convincing proof that at present, only those whose rare simplicity borders on a cunning desire to perpetuate the former hypocrisy can believe that socialism can be rectified and its lines straightened out by means of resolutions alone. Only yesterday, one might say, when, before the war, Heinemann turned towards a defense of imperialism, all, quote, respectable socialists considered him an unbalanced crank, of whom nobody spoke otherwise than in a tone of disdain. Today, the most prominent social democratic leaders of all countries have sunk entirely to Heinemann's position, differing from one another only in shades of opinion and in temperament. We are quite unable to find some more or less suitable parliamentary expression in appraising or characterizing the civic courage of such persons as, for instance, the Nasze Slovo authors, who write of Mr. Heinemann with contempt while speaking or saying nothing of Comrade Kautsky with deference or obsequiousness. Can such an attitude be reconciled with a respect for socialism and for one's convictions in general? If you are convinced that Heinemann's chauvinism is false and destructive, does it not follow that you should direct your criticism and attacks against Kautsky, the more influential and more dangerous defender of such views? Quick note here, Heinemann is Henry Heinemann. This was an English Marxist who used to be a conservative, then became a Marxist, was very off-putting to a lot of other people in the movement, and eventually acquired the kind of reputation that Lenin is discussing here. Continuing. In perhaps greater detail than anywhere else, Gesda's views have recently been expressed by the Gesdist Charles Dumas in a pamphlet entitled The Peace That We Desire. This chef du cabinet de Jules Gesda, as he styles himself on the title page of the pamphlet, naturally quotes the former patriotic declarations of the socialists. David, the German social chauvinist, does the same in his latest pamphlet on the defense of the fatherland. But he fails to refer to the Basel Manifesto. Plekhanov, who utters chauvinist banalities with an extraordinarily smug air, is likewise silent on the manifesto. Kautsky behaves just like Plekhanov. In quoting from the Basel Manifesto, he omits all the revolutionary passages, in other words, all the vital content, probably on the pretext of the censorship regulations. The police and the military authorities, whose censorship regulations forbid any mention of the class struggle or revolution, have rendered timely aid to the traitors in socialism. Perhaps the Basel Manifesto is just an empty appeal, which is devoid of any definite content, either historical or tactical, with a direct bearing on the concrete war of today. No, the reverse is true. The Basel Resolution has less idle declamation and more definite content than other resolutions have. The Basel Resolution speaks of the very same war that has now broken out, of the imperialist conflicts that have flared up in 1914 to 1915. The conflicts between Austria and Serbia over the Balkans, between Austria and Italy over Albania, etc., between Britain and Germany over markets and colonies in general, between Russia and Turkey, etc., over Armenia and Constantinople. All this is what the Basel Resolution speaks of, in anticipation of the present war. It follows from that resolution that the present war between, quote, the great powers of Europe, quote, cannot be justified on the slightest pretext of being in the least in the interests of the people, unquote. And if Plekhanov and Kautsky, to take two of the most typical and authoritative socialists, who are well known to us, one of whom writes in Russian, while the other is translated into Russian by the liquidators, are now, with the aid of Axelrod, seeking all sorts of popular justifications for the war, or rather vulgar ones taken from the bourgeois gutter press, if, with a learned mien and a stock of false quotations from Marx, they refer to precedents, to the wars of 1813 and 1870, Plekhanov, or of 1854 to 71, 1876 to 77, 1897, Kautsky, then in truth, only those without a shadow of socialist conviction, without a shred of socialist conscience, can take such arguments in earnest, can fail to call them otherwise than unparalleled Jesuitism, hypocrisy, and the prostitution of socialism. Let the executive, Vorstand, of the German party anathemize Mehring and Rosa Luxemburg's new magazine, Die Internationale, for its honest criticism of Kautsky. Let van der Velde, Plekhanov, Heinemann and company treat their opponents in the same manner, with the aid of the police of the Allied powers. We shall reply by simply reprinting the Basel Manifesto, which will show that the leaders have chosen a course that can only be called treachery. The Basel Resolution does not speak of a national or a people's war, examples of which have occurred in Europe, wars that were even typical of the period of 1789 to 1871, or of a revolutionary war, which Social Democrats have never renounced, but of the present war, which is the outcome of, quote, capitalist imperialism and, quote, dynastic interests, the outcome of the, quote, policy of conquest pursued by both groups of belligerent powers, the Austro-German and the Anglo-Franco-Russian. Plekhanov, Kautsky, and co. are flagrantly deceiving the workers by repeating the selfish lie of the bourgeoisie of all countries, which is striving with all its might to depict this imperialist and predatory war for colonies as a people's war, a war of defense for any side, when they seek to justify this war by citing historical examples of non-imperialist wars. The question as to the imperialist, predatory, and anti-proletarian character of the present war has long outgrown the purely theoretical stage. All the main features of imperialism have been theoretically assessed as a struggle being waged by the senile and moribund bourgeoisie for the partition of the world and the enslavement of smaller nations. These conclusions have been repeated thousands of times in the vast socialist press in all countries. In his pamphlet, The Impending War, from 1911, for example, the Frenchman Dalazy, a representative of one of our allied nations, has explained in simple terms the predatory character of the present war, with reference to the French bourgeoisie as well. But that is far from all. At Basel, representatives of the proletarian parties of all countries gave unanimous and formal expression to their unshakable conviction that a war of an imperialist character was impending, and drew tactical conclusions therefrom. For this reason, among others, we must flatly reject as sophistry all references to an inadequate discussion on the difference between national and international tactics. See Axelrod's latest interview in Naše Slovo, numbers 87 and 90, etc., etc. This is sophistry because a comprehensive scientific analysis of imperialism is one thing. That analysis is only underway and, in essence, is as infinite as science itself. The principles of socialist tactics against capitalist imperialism, which have been set forth in millions of copies of social democratic newspapers and in the decision of the International, are quite a different thing. Socialist parties are not debating clubs, but not debating clubs, let me re-emphasize, but organizations of the fighting proletariat. When a number of battalions have gone over to the enemy, they must be named and branded as traitors. We must not allow ourselves to be taken in by hypocritical assertions that, quote, not everybody understands imperialism in the same way, unquote, or that the chauvinist Kautsky and the chauvinist Kuhnau can write volumes about it, or that the question has not been adequately discussed, etc., etc. Capitalism will never be completely and exhaustively studied in all the manifestations of its predatory nature, and in all the most minute ramifications of its historical development and national features. Scholars, and especially the pedants, will never stop arguing over details. It would be ridiculous to give up the socialist struggle against capitalism and to desist from opposing, on such grounds, those who have betrayed that struggle. But what else are Kautsky, Kuhnau, Axelrod, and their like inviting us to do? Now, when war has broken out, no one has even attempted to examine the Basel Resolution and prove that it is erroneous. End of section 1, on to section 2. But perhaps sincere socialists supported the Basel Resolution in the anticipation that war would create a revolutionary situation, the events rebutting them as revolution has proved impossible. It is by means of sophistry like this that Kuhnau, and by the way, I'm really glad Lenin just labeled that a piece of sophistry because I read that over 3 times and I really didn't get it. Anyway, it is by means of sophistry like this that Kuhnau, in a pamphlet, Collapse of the Party, and a series of articles, has tried to justify his desertion to the camp of the bourgeoisie. The writings of nearly all the other social chauvinists, headed by Kautsky, hint at similar, quote, arguments. Hopes for a revolution have proved illusory, and it is not the business of a Marxist to fight for illusions, Kuhnau argues. This Struvist, however, does not say a word about illusions that were shared by all signatories to the Basel Manifesto. Like a most upright man, he would put the blame on the extreme leftists such as Pannekoek and Radek. Let us consider the substance of the argument that the authors of the Basel Manifesto sincerely expected the advent of a revolution, but were rebutted by the events. The Basel Manifesto says, 1, that war will create an economic and political crisis. 2, that the workers will regard their participation in war as a crime, and as criminal any, quote, shooting each other down for the profit of the capitalists, for the sake of dynastic honor and of diplomatic secret treaties, unquote, and that war evokes, quote, indignation and revolt in the workers. 3, that it is the duty of socialists to take advantage of this crisis and of the workers' temper so as to, quote, rouse the people and hasten the downfall of capitalism, unquote. 4, that all governments, without exception, can start a war only, quote, at their own peril. 5, that governments, quote, are afraid of a proletarian revolution. 6, that governments, quote, should remember the Paris Commune, i.e. civil war, the 1905 revolution in Russia, etc. All these are perfectly clear ideas. They do not guarantee that revolution will take place, but lay stress on a precise characterization of facts and trends. Whoever declares, with regard to these ideas and arguments, that the anticipated revolution has proved illusory, is displaying not a Marxist, but a Struvist and police renegade attitude towards revolution. To the Marxist, it is indisputable that a revolution is impossible without a revolutionary situation. Furthermore, it is not every revolutionary situation that leads to revolution. What, generally speaking, are the symptoms of a revolutionary situation? We shall certainly not be mistaken if we indicate the following 3 major symptoms. 1, when it is impossible for the ruling classes to maintain their rule without any change. When there is a crisis, in one form or another, among the upper classes, a crisis in the policy of the ruling class, leading to a fissure through which the discontent and indignation of the oppressed classes burst forth. For a revolution to take place, it is usually insufficient for the lower classes not to want to live in the old way. It is also necessary that the upper classes should be unable to live in the old way. That's point 1. Point 2, when the suffering and want of the oppressed classes have grown more acute than usual. And 3, when, as a consequence of the above causes, there is a considerable increase in the activity of the masses who uncomplainingly allow themselves to be robbed in, quote, peacetime, but in turbulent times are drawn both by all the circumstances of the crisis and by the upper classes themselves into independent historical action. So, commenting there, this is key. So, Lenin's 3 major symptoms, and there may be others, like he says, but these 3 are sure to be true. So again, number 1, it's impossible for the ruling classes to maintain their rule without changing. There's a crisis in the upper classes, a crisis in the policy of the ruling class, and then there is a fissure through which the discontent and indignation of the oppressed classes burst forth. So usually the oppressed class doesn't want to be oppressed, but that's not enough for a revolution. It should also be that the upper classes are unable to live in the old way, meaning the system has reached a point where it absolutely has to change. Otherwise, you could have a very pissed off oppressed class who, in peacetime, as it were, of the exploitation of the system, could just somehow, I guess, manage to get enough agitation, education, and organization going to have a revolution. But really, it helps when there's a crisis in the system, in the ruling class, and some kind of a change needs to take place, and the upper class can't really figure out how to adapt the system. Point 2 is that the suffering and want of the oppressed classes have grown more acute than usual. I would say probably as a result of whatever crisis that it is, because that does give impetus. You could have a crisis in the system or the ruling classes, but if it's really not affecting the oppressed classes, then we may not spring into action. And then 3, as a consequence, the masses get drawn into the crisis and they start to take action. We start to take action. So that's key. Moving on. Without these objective changes, which are independent of the will, not only of individual groups and parties, but even of individual classes, a revolution, as a general rule, is impossible. The totality of all these objective changes is called a revolutionary situation. Such a situation existed in 1905 in Russia, and in all revolutionary periods in the West. It also existed in Germany in the 60s of the last century, and in Russia in 1859 to 61, and 1879 to 80, although no revolution occurred in these instances. Why was that? It was because it is not every revolutionary situation that actually gives rise to a revolution. Revolution arises only out of a situation in which the above-mentioned objective changes are accompanied by a subjective change, namely the ability of the revolutionary class to take revolutionary mass action strong enough to break or dislocate the old government, which never, not even in a period of crisis, falls if it is not toppled over. Commenting again, that last point is important, that the old government will never, not even in a crisis, fall. You have to push it. Okay? So, for example, half the US electorate doesn't vote. Congress has what, like a 10% approval rating? But they're just going to keep ticking on. Okay? They're never going to just fall apart of their own accord. They're going to, they have the power and resources to reorganize at least on the level that they're currently working on, but it's not going to fall apart of its own accord. It'll just keep going and going and going if it's the best that the bourgeoisie can come up with for running their system. So, yeah. Such are the Marxist views on revolution, views that have been developed many, many times, have been accepted as indisputable by all Marxists, and for us, Russians, were corroborated in a particularly striking fashion by the experience of 1905. Comment, that was the first Russian Revolution. It didn't succeed at overthrowing the Tsar or capitalism, but it was a significant milestone in the revolutionary process in Russia. What then did the Basel Manifesto assume in this respect in 1912, and what took place in 1914 to 15? It assumed that a revolutionary situation, which it briefly described as, quote, an economic and political crisis, would arise. Has such a situation arisen? Undoubtedly it has. The social chauvinist Lynch, who defends chauvinism more candidly, publicly, and honestly than the hypocrites Kunow, Kautsky, Plekhanov, and company do, has gone so far as to say, quote, what we are passing through is a kind of revolution, unquote, quoting from his pamphlet, German Social Democracy in the War, 1915. A political crisis exists. No government is sure of tomorrow. Not one is secure against the danger of financial collapse, loss of territory, expulsion from its country in the way that the Belgian government was expelled. All governments are sleeping on a volcano. All are themselves calling for the masses to display initiative and heroism. The entire political regime of Europe has been shaken, and hardly anybody will deny that we have entered and are entering ever deeper. I write this on the day of Italy's declaration of war, a period of immense political upheavals, when, 2 months after the declaration of war, Kautsky wrote on October 2nd, 1914 in Die Neue Zeit, that, quote, never is government so strong, never are parties so weak as at the outbreak of a war. This was a sample of the falsification of historical science which Kautsky has perpetrated to please the pseudocums and other opportunists. In the first place, never do governments stand in such need of agreement with all the parties of the ruling classes, or of the peaceful submission of the oppressed classes to that rule as in time of war. Secondly, even though at the beginning of a war, and especially in a country that expects a speedy victory, the government seems all-powerful. Nobody in the world has ever linked expectations of a revolutionary situation exclusively with the beginning of a war, and still less has anybody ever identified the seeming with the actual. It was generally known, seen, and admitted that a European war would be more severe than any war in the past. This is being borne out in ever greater measure by the experience of the war. The conflagration is spreading. The political foundations of Europe are being shaken more and more. The sufferings of the masses are appalling. The efforts of governments, the bourgeoisie, and the opportunists to hush up these sufferings proving ever more futile. The war profits being obtained by certain groups of capitalists are monstrously high, and contradictions are growing extremely acute. The smoldering indignation of the masses, the vague yearning of society's downtrodden and ignorant strata for a kindly or democratic peace, the beginning of discontent among the lower classes, all these are facts. The longer the war drags on, and the more acute it becomes, the more the governments themselves foster, and must foster, the activity of the masses, whom they call upon to make extraordinary effort and self-sacrifice. The experience of the war, like the experience of any crisis in history, of any great calamity, and any sudden turn in human life, stuns and breaks some people, but enlightens and tempers others. Taken by and large, and considering the history of the world as a whole, the number and strength of the second kind of people have, with the exception of individual cases of the decline and fall of one state or another, proved greater than those of the former kind. Quick note there, just on the term opportunists. In Marxist lexicon, opportunism is when socialists basically become class collaborationists. They abandon proletarian interests to start working with the bourgeoisie. Why is this bad? Because the bourgeoisie and the proletariat have opposing interests. It's irreconcilable. And anyway, you can't do this. So that's opportunism. And in the case of World War I, we have a number of audiobooks on this on the channel, and also the previous couple of entries in the basic Marxism-Leninism study course discuss this whole process that Lenin is describing here of the socialist leaders of Europe siding with their bourgeoisie and embracing a kind of nationalism in the face of war, in the war specifically. Whereas Lenin resisted this, and the Bolshevik faction resisted this, and then of course they had a successful revolution in 1917, whereas the rest of Europe did not. So anyway, proceeding. Far from immediately ending all these sufferings and all this enhancement of contradictions, the conclusion of peace will, in many respects, make those sufferings more keenly and immediately felt by the most backward masses of the population. In a word, a revolutionary situation obtains in most of the advanced countries and the great powers of Europe. In this respect, the prediction of the Basel Manifesto has been fully confirmed. To deny this truth, either directly or indirectly, or to ignore it, as Kuhnau, Plekhanov, Kautsky, and co. have done, means telling a big lie, deceiving the working class and serving the bourgeoisie. In Social Democrat numbers 34, 40, and 41, we cited facts which prove that those who fear revolution, petty bourgeois Christian parsons, the general staffs and millionaires' newspapers, are compelled to admit that symptoms of a revolutionary situation do exist in Europe. Will this situation last long? And how much more acute will it become? Will it lead to revolution? These are things we do not know, and nobody can know. The answer can be provided only by the experience gained during the development of revolutionary sentiment and the transition to revolutionary action by the advanced class, the proletariat. There can be no talk in this connection about illusions or their repudiation, since no socialist has ever guaranteed that this war, and not the next one, that today's revolutionary situation, and not tomorrow's, will produce a revolution. What we are discussing is the indisputable and fundamental duty of all socialists, that of revealing to the masses the existence of a revolutionary situation, explaining its scope and depth, arousing the proletariat's revolutionary consciousness and revolutionary determination, helping it to go over to revolutionary action, and forming for that purpose organizations suited to the revolutionary situation. No influential or responsible socialist has ever dared to feel doubt that this is the duty of the socialist parties, without spreading or harboring the least illusions. The Basel Manifesto spoke specifically of this duty of the socialists, to rouse and to stir up the people, and not to lull them with chauvinism, as Plekhanov, Axelrod, and Kautsky have done, to take advantage of the crisis, so as to hasten the downfall of capitalism, and to be guided by the examples of the Commune and of October-December 1905. The present party's failure to perform that duty meant their treachery, political death, renunciation of their own role, and desertion to the side of the bourgeoisie. End of section 2, beginning section 3. But how could it have happened that the most prominent representatives and leaders of the Second International have betrayed socialism? We shall deal with this question in detail later, after we have examined the attempts being made to give this treachery theoretical justification. We shall try to characterize the principal theories of social chauvinism, of which Plekhanov, who in the main reiterates the arguments of the Anglo-French chauvinists, Hindman and his new adherents, and Kautsky, who advances much more subtle arguments, with their semblance of far greater theoretical profundity, may be regarded as representatives. Perhaps the most primitive of these is the "who started it" theory, which may be worded as follows: "We've been attacked and are defending ourselves. The interests of the proletariat demand that the violators of the peace in Europe should be properly dealt with." This is merely a rehash of the declarations made by all governments and of the outcries of the bourgeois and the gutter press all over the world. Plekhanov embellishes even this threadbare piece of vulgarity with his inevitable Jesuitical reference to dialectics. To be able to assess the concrete situation, he says, we must first of all find out who started it and punish him. All other problems will have to wait until another situation arises. See Plekhanov's pamphlet, The War, 1914, and Axelrod's repetition of its arguments in Golos, numbers 86 and 87. Plekhanov has set a new record in the noble sport of substituting sophistry for dialectics. The sophist grabs at one of the many arguments. It was Hegel who long ago very properly observed that arguments can be found to prove anything in the world. Dialectics calls for a many-sided investigation into a given social phenomenon in its development, and for the external and the seeming to be reduced to the fundamental motive forces, to the development of the productive forces, and to the class struggle. Plekhanov has plucked out a quotation from the German Social Democratic press. The Germans themselves, before the war, admitted that Austria and Germany had, quote, started it. He says, and there you go. He does not mention the fact that the Russian socialists repeatedly exposed the Tsarist plans of conquest of Galicia, Armenia, etc. He doesn't make the slightest attempt to study the economic and diplomatic history of at least the past 3 decades, which history proves conclusively that the conquest of colonies, the looting of foreign countries, the ousting and ruining of the more successful rivals have been the backbone of the politics of both groups of the now belligerent powers. There's a footnote there. Very instructive is The War of Steel and Gold, London 1914, a book dated March 1914, by the British pacifist Brailsford, who is not averse to posing as a socialist. The author clearly realizes that national problems are now in the background and have been solved, that this is not the issue of the day, that, quote, the typical question of modern diplomacy, unquote, is the Baghdad Railway, the contracts for rails for it, the Moroccan mines, and the like. The author correctly considers as one of the, quote, most instructive incidents in the recent history of European diplomacy the fact that French patriots and British imperialists fought against Caillou's attempts in 1911 and 1913 to come to terms with Germany on the basis of an agreement on the division of spheres of colonial influence and the quotation of German securities on the Paris Bourse. The British and the French bourgeoisie frustrated such an agreement. The aim of imperialism is the export of capital to the weaker countries. In Britain, the profits from such capital totaled between £90 million and £100 million in 1899 and £140 million in 1909. We would add that in a recent speech, Lloyd George calculated it at £200 million, which is almost 2,000 million, or 2 billion, rubles. Unsavory machinations and bribing of high-ranking Turks and cushy jobs in India and Egypt for the younger sons of the British aristocracy. Such are the main features. An insignificant minority gains from armaments and wars, he says, but that minority is backed by society and the financiers, whereas behind the adherents of peace, there is a disunited population. A pacifist who today talks about peace and disarmament tomorrow proves to be a member of a party wholly dependent on the war contractors. If the Triple Entente wins, it will grab Morocco and partition Persia. If the Triple Alliance wins, it will take over Tripoli, strengthen its hold on Bosnia, and subordinate Turkey. In March 1906, London and Paris provided Russia with thousands of millions and helped Tsarism crush the movement for freedom. Today, Britain is helping Russia to throttle Persia. Russia instigated the Balkan War. Comment there. This goes on to this day with right-wing reactionary forces, counter-revolutionary forces, funneling money and arms and other resources to crush any kind of a revolutionary or even progressive movement. There's nothing novel about this, is there? All this is common knowledge and has been reiterated 1,000 times in social democratic newspapers all over the world. On the eve of the war, a British bourgeois sees all this as clearly as can be. Against the background of these simple, universally known facts, what dribbling nonsense, what smug hypocrisy, what glib lies are the theories advanced by Plekhanov and Potrasov concerning Germany's guilt, or Kautsky's theory concerning the prospects of disarmament and a lasting peace under capitalism. End of footnote, now back to the main text. With reference to wars, the main thesis of dialectics, which has been so shamelessly distorted by Plekhanov to please the bourgeoisie, is that, quote, war is simply the continuation of politics by other, i.e. violent, means, unquote. Such is the formula of Clausewitz, one of the greatest writers on the history of war, whose thinking was stimulated by Hegel, and it was always the standpoint of Marx and Engels, who regarded war as the continuation of the politics of the powers concerned, and the various classes within these countries, in a definite period. There's a footnote there off of Clausewitz. This is quoting from Karl von Clausewitz, von Kriege, quote, all know that wars are caused only by the political relations of governments and of nations, but ordinarily one pictures the situation as if, with the beginning of the war, these relations cease and a totally new situation is created which follows its own laws. We assert, on the contrary, that war is nothing but the continuation of political relations with the intervention of other means. And back to the main text. Plekhanov's crude chauvinism is based on exactly the same theoretical stand as the more subtle and sacro-conciliatory chauvinism of Kautsky, who uses the following arguments when he gives his blessing to the desertion of socialists in all countries to the side of their, quote, own capitalists. Quote, it is the right and duty of everyone to defend his fatherland. That's just so bad. True internationalism consists in this right being recognized for the socialists of all nations, including those who are at war with any nation. See Die Neue Zeit, October 2, 1914, unquote. This matchless reasoning is such an unutterable travesty of socialism that the best answer to it would be to strike a medal with the portraits of Wilhelm II and Nicholas II on one side and of Plekhanov and Kautsky on the other. True internationalism, we're told, means that we must justify German workers firing at French workers and French workers firing at German workers in the name of, quote, defense of the fatherland. However, closer examination of the theoretical premises in Kautsky's reasoning will reveal the self-same idea that Clausewitz ridiculed about 80 years ago, viz. That when war breaks out, all historically created political relations between nations and classes cease, and that a totally new situation arises. There are simply those that attack and those that are defending themselves, quote, simply the warding off of the, quote, enemies of the fatherland. The oppression of a number of nations which comprise over half the population of the globe by the dominant imperialist nations, the rivalry between the bourgeoisie of these countries for a share of the loot, the desire of the capitalists to split and suppress the working class movement, all these have suddenly disappeared from the pen of Plekhanov and Kautsky, although they themselves were describing these very politics for decades before the war. In this connection, false references to Marx and Engels are the crowning argument of these two chieftains of social chauvinism. Plekhanov recalls Prussia's National War of 1813 and Germany's National War of 1870, while Kautsky argues with a most learned air that Marx examined the question of whose success, i.e. the success of which bourgeoisie, was more desirable in the wars of 1854 to 55, 1859, and 1870 to 71, and that the Marxists did likewise in the wars of 1876 to 7 and 1897. In all times, the sophists have been in the habit of citing instances that refer to situations which are dissimilar in principle. The wars of the past to which they make references were a, quote, continuation of the politics of the bourgeoisie's national movements of many years standing, movements against an alien yoke and against absolutism, Turkish or Russian. At that time, the only question was the success of which bourgeoisie was to be preferred. For wars of this type, the Marxists could rouse the peoples in advance, fostering national hatred, as Marx did in 1848, and later when he called for a war against Russia, and as Engels in 1859 fostered German national hatred of their oppressors, Napoleon III and Russian Tsarism. There's a footnote there. Mr. Gardinin in Life, the newspaper of the Socialist Revolutionary Party, labels as, quote, revolutionary chauvinism, but chauvinism, Marx's stand in 1848 for revolutionary war against the European nations, which had in fact shown themselves to be counter-revolutionary, viz., the Slavs and the Russians in particular. This reproof of Marx reveals once again the opportunism, or, properly speaking, and the inconsequence of this left socialist revolutionary. We Marxists have always stood, and still stand, for a revolutionary war against counter-revolutionary nations. For instance, if socialism is victorious in America or in Europe in 1920, and Japan and China, let us say, then move their Bismarcks against us, if only diplomatically at first, we certainly would be in favor of an offensive revolutionary war against them. It seems strange to you, Mr. Gardinin, but then you are a revolutionary of the Ropschen type. End of footnote, back to the main text. Comparing the, quote, continuation of the politics of combating feudalism and absolutism, the politics of the bourgeoisie and its struggle for liberty, with the continuation of the politics of a decrepit, i.e. imperialist bourgeoisie, i.e. of a bourgeoisie which has plundered the entire world, a reactionary bourgeoisie, which, in alliance with feudal landlords, attempts to crush the proletariat, means comparing chalk and cheese. It is like comparing the representatives of the bourgeoisie, quote-unquote, Robespierre, Garibaldi, and Gelyabov, with such representatives of the bourgeoisie as Millerand, Salandra, and Guchkov. One cannot be a Marxist without feeling the deepest respect for the great bourgeois revolutionaries who had an historic right to speak for their respective bourgeois fatherlands, and in the struggle against feudalism, led tens of millions of people in the new nations towards a civilized life. Neither can one be a Marxist without feeling contempt for the sophistry of Plekhanov and Kautsky, who speak of the defense of the fatherland with regard to the throttling of Belgium by the German imperialists, or with regard to the pact between the imperialists of Britain, France, Russia, and Italy on the plundering of Austria and Turkey. There is another Marxist theory of social chauvinism which runs as follows. Socialism is based on the rapid development of capitalism, the development of capitalism in my country, and consequently the advent of socialism there will be speeded up by her victory. My country's defeat will retard her economic development and consequently the advent of socialism. In Russia, this Struvist theory has been developed by Plekhanov and among the Germans by Lensch and others. Kautsky argues against this crude theory, against Lensch, who defends it overtly, and against Gunau, who defends it covertly. His sole purpose, however, is to reconcile the social chauvinists of all countries on the basis of a more subtle and more Jesuitical chauvinist theory. We need not dwell on this crude theory. Struve's critical notes appeared in 1894, and during the past 20 years, Russian social democrats have become thoroughly familiar with this habit of the enlightened Russian bourgeois of advancing their ideas and advocating their desires under the cloak of a Marxism, quote-unquote, purged of revolutionary content. Struvism is not merely a Russian, but, as recent events clearly prove, an international striving on the part of the bourgeois theoreticians to kill Marxism with kindness, to crush it in their embraces, to kill it with a feigned acceptance of all the truly scientific aspects and elements of Marxism except its agitational, demagogic, blankest utopian, quote-unquote, aspect. In other words, they take from Marxism all that is acceptable to the liberal bourgeoisie, including the struggle for reforms, the class struggle without the proletarian dictatorship, the general recognition of socialist ideals, and the substitution of a new order for capitalism. They cast aside only the living soul of Marxism, only its revolutionary content. Quick comment. there was a commenter posted recently, the social democracy that a lot of the SOCDEMs want is, it's a mixed economy, all right? Because they're always saying things like, oh no, pure socialism's no good, it devolves into tyranny. You need a balance of socialism and capitalism. Except that the balance they're looking for is like 95% capitalism and 5% socialism. So, yeah, this is what's been happening since forever. Since Marx and Engels came onto the scene, since scientific socialism was assembled out of, all the previous forms of utopian socialism and improved into what became Marxism and then later Marxism-Leninism through the efforts of Lenin. They've been trying to, meaning the liberals, have been trying to, well, exactly like Lenin says, kill it with kindness, accept the hell out of it. Except for, that tanky shit, that's going to lead to tyranny. You don't want revolution. You just want a kinder, gentler bourgeoisie. You just want exploitation with a little padding on it. Yeah. All right, continuing. Marxism is the theory of the proletarian movement for emancipation. It is clear, therefore, that the class-conscious workers must pay the utmost attention to any substitution of Struvism for Marxism. The motive forces in this process are varied and manifold. We shall indicate only the three main forces. 1, the development of science is providing more and more material that proves that Marx was right. This makes it necessary to fight against him hypocritically, not to oppose the principles of Marxism openly, but to pretend to accept Marxism, while emasculating it by sophistry and turning it into a holy icon, which is harmless, in fact, to the bourgeoisie. 2, the development of opportunism among the social democratic parties fosters such a refashioning of Marxism and adjusts it for a justification of all kinds of concessions to opportunism. Again, working with the bourgeoisie and basically forsaking your proletarian interests for bourgeois interests. 3, the epoch of imperialism is one in which the world is divided among the great privileged nations which oppress all other nations. Morsels of the loot obtained as a result of these privileges and this oppression undoubtedly fall to the share of certain sections of the petty bourgeoisie and to the working class aristocracy and bureaucracy. These strata, which form an insignificant minority of the proletariat and of the toiling masses, gravitate towards Struvism because it provides them with a justification of their alliance with their own, quote-unquote, national bourgeoisie against the oppressed masses of all nations. We shall have occasion to deal with this later in connection with the causes of the collapse of the International. So that's the end of section 3. Before we get to section 4, this last part is important for understanding today concepts like third worldism, Pan-Africanism, and other struggles of the developing nations against oppression by imperialist countries. In other words, it's not just within a nation that national bourgeoisie oppresses its own population, its own domestic citizenry, but also whole nations oppress other whole nations. And then as capitalism has gotten more and more consolidated and conglomerated over the decades of the 20th century and on, now you've just basically got one system headquartered in the United States, Canada, the imperialist countries, oppressing the global south and so on. And the domestic population of these countries is, well, just like Lenin said, morsels of the loot obtained as a result of these privileges and this oppression of the global south, developing world, undoubtedly fall to the share of certain sections of the petty bourgeoisie, the domestic one, and to the working class aristocracy and bureaucracy. So in other words, he's saying that living in an imperialist country as the labor aristocracy, you get bought off basically by the super profits of imperialism, because that bourgeoisie is no longer just pulling its wealth from the small scale domestic exploitation that it's doing. I mean, it's doing that, but it's also plundering Africa, Latin America, Asia, and where basically you got to think a lot bigger to try to take on capitalism, imperialism, in the 20th and especially the 21st century. So, moving on to section 4. The most subtle theory of social chauvinism, one that has been most skillfully touched up to look scientific and international, is the theory of ultra-imperialism advanced by Kautsky. Here is the clearest, most precise, and most recent exposition of this theory in the words of the author himself. Quote, "The subsiding of the protectionist movement in Britain, the lowering of tariffs in America, the trend towards disarmament, the rapid decline in the export of capital from France and Germany in the years immediately preceding the war, finally, the growing international interweaving between the various cliques of finance capital. All this has caused me to consider whether the present imperialist policy cannot be supplanted by a new ultra-imperialist policy, which will introduce the joint exploitation of the world by internationally united finance capital in place of the mutual rivalries of national finance capital. Such a new phase of capitalism is at any rate conceivable. Can it be achieved? Sufficient premises are still lacking to enable us to answer this question." Unquote. It's quoting from Die Neue Zeit, number 5, 1915. Quoting again, "The course and the outcome of the present war may prove decisive in this respect. It may entirely crush the weak beginnings of ultra-imperialism by fanning," boy was he off, "by fanning to the highest degree national hatred also among the finance capitalists, by intensifying the armaments race, and by making a second world war inevitable. Under such conditions, the thing I foresaw and formulated in my pamphlet, The Road to Power, would come true in horrifying dimensions. Class antagonisms would become sharper and sharper, and with it would come the moral decay," literally going out of business, Wirtschaftung, bankruptcy, "of capitalism." Parentheses, it must be noted that by this pretentious word, Kautsky means simply the hatred which the strata intermediary between the proletariat and finance capital, namely the intelligentsia, the petty bourgeois, even small capitalists, feel towards capitalism. End parentheses. But the war may end otherwise. It may lead to the strengthening of the weak beginnings of ultra-imperialism. Its lessons, parentheses from Lenin, note this, may hasten developments for which we would have to wait a long time under peace conditions. If it does lead to this, to an agreement between nations, disarmament, and a lasting peace, then the worst of the causes that led to the growing moral decay of capitalism before the war may disappear. The new phase will, of course, bring the proletariat new misfortunes, perhaps even worse, but for a time, ultra-imperialism, quote, could create an era of new hopes and expectations within the framework of capitalism, unquote. How is a justification of social chauvinism deduced from this theory? In a way rather strange for a theoretician, namely as follows. The left-wing social democrats in Germany say that imperialism and the wars it engenders are not accidental, but an inevitable product of capitalism, which has brought about the domination of finance capital. It is therefore necessary to go over to the revolutionary mass struggle as the period of comparatively peaceful development has ended. The right-wing social democrats brazenly declare that since imperialism is, quote, necessary, we too must be imperialists. Kautsky, in the role of the center, quote unquote, tries to reconcile these views. Quote, "The extreme lefts," Kautsky writes in his pamphlet, The National State, the Imperialist State, and the League of States, 1915, wish to contrapose socialism to inevitable imperialism, i.e., not only the propaganda for socialism that we've been carrying on for half a century in contraposition to all forms of capitalist domination, but the immediate achievement of socialism. This seems very radical, but it can only serve to drive into the camp of imperialism anyone who does not believe in the immediate practical achievement of socialism, unquote. When he speaks of the immediate achievement of socialism, Kautsky is resorting to a subterfuge, for he takes advantage of the fact that in Germany, especially under the military censorship, revolutionary action cannot be spoken of. Kautsky is well aware that the left wing is demanding of the party immediate propaganda in favor of and preparation for revolutionary action, not the, quote, immediate practical achievement of socialism. From the necessity of imperialism, the left wing deduces the necessity of revolutionary action. The theory of ultra-imperialism, however, serves Kautsky as a means to justify the opportunists, to present the situation in such a light as to create the impression that they have not gone over to the bourgeoisie, but simply do not believe that socialism can arrive immediately and expect that a new era of disarmament and lasting peace might be ushered in. This theory boils down and can only boil down to the following. Kautsky is exploiting the hope for a new peaceful era of capitalisms as to justify the adhesion of the opportunists and the official social democratic parties to the bourgeoisie and their rejection of revolutionary, i.e. proletarian, tactics in the present stormy era. This, despite the solemn declarations of the Basel Resolution. At the same time, Kautsky does not say that this new phase follows, and necessarily so, from certain definite circumstances and conditions. On the contrary, he states quite outspokenly that he cannot yet even decide whether or not this new phase is achievable. Indeed, consider the trends towards the new era which have been indicated by Kautsky. Astonishingly enough, the author has included among the economic facts, quote, the trend towards disarmament. This means that behind innocent Philistine talk and pipe dreaming, Kautsky is trying to hide from indisputable facts that do not at all fit in with the theory of the mitigation of contradictions. Kautsky's ultra-imperialism, this term incidentally does not at all express what the author wants to say, implies a tremendous mitigation of the contradictions of capitalism. We're told that protectionism is subsiding in Britain and America, but where is the least trend towards a new era? Extreme protectionism is now subsiding in America, but protectionism remains, just as the privileges, the preferential tariffs favoring Britain, have remained in that country's colonies. Let us recall what the passage from the previous and peaceful, quote-unquote, period of capitalism to the present and imperialist period has been based on. Free competition has yielded to monopolist capitalist combines, and the world has been partitioned. Both these facts and factors are obviously of worldwide significance. Free trade and peaceful competition were possible and necessary as long as capital was in a position to enlarge its colonies without hindrance and seize unoccupied land in Africa, etc. And as long as the concentration of capital was still weak and no monopolist concerns existed, i.e. concerns of a magnitude permitting domination in an entire branch of industry. The appearance and growth of such monopolist concerns, has this process been stopped in Britain or America? Not even Kautsky will dare deny that the war has accelerated and intensified it, have rendered the free competition of former times impossible. They've cut the ground from under its feet, while the partition of the world compels the capitalists to go over from peaceful expansion to an armed struggle for the repartitioning of colonies and spheres of influence. It is ridiculous to think that the subsiding of protectionism in two countries can change anything in this respect. Let us further examine the fall in capital exports from two countries in the course of a few years. In 1912, these two countries, France and Germany, each had about 35,000 million marks, about 17,000 million rubles. This is, again, of course, billions, 1,000 million, of foreign investments. This, according to Harms's statistics, while Britain alone had twice that sum. The increase in exports of capital has never proceeded evenly under capitalism, nor could that have been so. Kautsky dares not even suggest that the accumulation of capital has decreased, or that the capacity of the home market has undergone any important change, say through a big improvement in the conditions of the masses. In these circumstances, the fall in capital exports from two countries over several years cannot imply the advent of a new era. Quote, the growing international interweaving between the cliques of finance capital, unquote, is the only really general and indubitable tendency, not during the last few years and in two countries, but throughout the whole capitalist world. But why should this trend engender a striving towards disarmament, not armaments as hitherto? Take any one of the world-famous cannon and arms manufacturers, Armstrong, for instance. The British Economist, May 1st, 1915, published figures showing that this firm's profits rose from 606,000 pounds, about 6 million rubles, in 1905 and 6 to 856,000 pounds in 1913, and to 940,000 pounds, 9 million rubles, in 1914. Here, the intertwining of finance capital is most pronounced and is on the increase. German capitalists have holdings in British firms. British firms built submarines for Austria, and so on. Interlinked on a worldwide scale, capital is thriving on armaments and wars. To think that the fact of capital in the individual states combining and interlinking on an international scale must of necessity produce an economic trend toward disarmament means, in effect, allowing well-meaning Philistine expectations of an easing of class contradictions take the place of the actual intensification of these contradictions. That's the end of section 4. Now we're moving on to section 5. It is in a wholly Philistine spirit that Kautsky speaks of the lessons of the war, presenting those lessons in the light of a moral abhorrence at the misery it causes. Here, for instance, is how he argues in the pamphlet entitled The National State. Quote, "It stands beyond doubt, and needs no proof, that there are strata of the population that are greatly interested in universal peace and development. The petty bourgeoisie and the small peasants, and even many capitalists and intellectuals, are not tied to imperialism by any interests that outweigh the damage suffered by these strata as a result of war and armaments." Unquote. This was written in February 1915. The facts show that all the propertied classes, down to the petty bourgeoisie and the intelligentsia, have joined the imperialists en masse, and yet Kautsky, like Chekhov's man in a muffler, shrugs off the facts with an air of extraordinary smugness and with the aid of saccharine phrases. He judges of the interests of the petty bourgeoisie not by their conduct, but by the words of certain petty bourgeois, although at every step such words are refuted by the deeds. It is exactly like judging of the interests of the bourgeoisie in general, not by their deeds, but by the benevolent speeches made by bourgeois clergymen who avow that the present-day system is imbued with the ideals of Christianity. Kautsky applies Marxism in a way that voids it of all content, so that what remains is the catchword of interests in a kind of supernatural, otherworldly meaning, for it implies not real economics, but pious wishes for the common weal. Marxism appraises interests according to the class antagonisms and the class struggle, which find expression in millions of facts of daily life. The petty bourgeoisie prattle and dream of the abatement of antagonisms, whose aggravation, they argue, leads to, quote, harmful consequences. Imperialism means the subjugation of all strata of the propertied classes to finance capital, and the partition of the world among 5 or 6 great powers, most of which are now involved in the war. The partition of the world among the great powers means that all their propertied classes are interested in possessing colonies and spheres of influence, in oppressing other nations, and in securing the more or less lucrative posts and privileges that stem from belonging to a great power, an oppressor nation. There's a footnote there. E. Schultzu states that by 1915, the value of securities in the whole world was calculated at 732,000 million francs, or 732 billion francs, including state and municipal loans, the mortgages and shares of commercial and manufacturing corporations, etc. Of this sum, Britain's share was 130,000 million, that of the United States 115,000 million, France 100,000 million, and Germany 75,000 million, i.e. the share of all 4 great powers being 420,000 million francs, over half the total, which again was 732. From this, one can realize the advantages and privileges accruing to the leading great powers which have outstripped other nations, oppressing and plundering the latter. To a great power, defense of the fatherland means defense of the right to share in the plundering of foreign countries. In Russia, as is common knowledge, capitalist imperialism is weaker than military feudal imperialism is. And just a quick correction, that was E. Schultz. There is a, or Schulze, excuse me, there's a typo. It says Schultzu, but it should be Schulze. All right, back to the main text. Life cannot go on in the old way, in the comparatively tranquil, cultured, and peaceful conditions of a capitalism that is smoothly developing and gradually spreading to new countries. A new epoch has arrived. Finance capital ousts, and will completely oust, a particular country from the ranks of great powers, will deprive it of its colonies and spheres of influence, as Germany, which has gone to war with Britain, threatens to do. And it will deprive the petty bourgeoisie of their dominant nation privileges and additional incomes. This has been proved by the war. It is the outcome of that aggravation of antagonisms which has long been admitted by all, including Kautsky in his pamphlet, The Road to Power. Now that the armed conflict for great power privileges has become a fact, Kautsky wants to persuade the capitalists and the petty bourgeoisie to believe that war is horrible, while disarmament is beneficial, in exactly the same way and with exactly the same results as the Christian churchman, speaking from the pulpit, would persuade the capitalists to believe that love of one's fellow men is a divine commandment, as well as the spiritual yearning and the moral law of civilization. What Kautsky calls an economic trend towards ultra-imperialism is just a petty bourgeois exhortation to the financiers that they should refrain from doing evil. The export of capital? But more capital is exported to independent countries such as the United States of America than to the colonies. The seizure of colonies. But they all have been seized, and nearly all of them are striving for liberation. Quote, India may cease to be a British possession, but as an integral empire, it will never fall under the sway of another foreign power, unquote. Quote, any attempt on the part of any industrial capitalist state to acquire for itself a colonial empire sufficient to make it independent of other countries in regard to raw materials must cause all other capitalist states to unite against it and involve it in endless and exhausting wars without bringing it nearer to its goal. Such a policy would be the surest road toward the bankruptcy of the entire economic life of that state, unquote. Is this not a Philistine attempt to persuade financiers to renounce imperialism? Any attempt to frighten capitalists with the prospect of bankruptcy is like advising against speculating in shares on the stock exchange because many fortunes have been lost in this way. Capital gains from the bankruptcy of a rival capitalist or of a rival nation because in this way capital becomes more concentrated. Hence, the keener and closer economic competition becomes, i.e. the economic driving of a competitor towards bankruptcy, the more the capitalists strive to add military pressure in order to drive the competitor in that direction. The fewer the countries to which capital can still be exported as advantageously as to colonies or to such dependent states as Turkey, since in such cases the financier reaps a triple profit as against capital exports to a free, independent, and civilized country like the USA. The fiercer is the struggle for the subjugation and partition of Turkey, China, etc. That is what economic theory reveals about the period of finance capital and imperialism. That is what the facts reveal. But Kautsky turns everything into a trite, petty bourgeois moral. It is not worthwhile getting worked up, and certainly not worthwhile going to war over the partition of Turkey or the seizure of India, since they cannot be held for long anyway, and moreover it would be better to develop capitalism peacefully. It would be better still, of course, to develop capitalism and expand the home market by increasing wages. This is quite, quote, conceivable, and it is a very fitting topic for a churchman to preach on to the financiers. The good Kautsky has almost succeeded in persuading the German financiers that it is not worthwhile waging war against Britain for the colonies because these colonies will soon secure their liberation in any case. Britain's exports to and imports from Egypt between 1872 and 1912 haven't kept pace with the overall growth of British exports and imports, whence the Marxist Kautsky draws the following moral, quote, we have no reason to suppose that British trade with Egypt would have been less developed as a result of the mere operation of economic factors without military operation, unquote. Quote, capital's urge to expand can be best promoted not by the violent methods of imperialism, but by peaceful democracy. Comment, So yeah, the US does that now. They spread democracy all over the world. The catch? By violence. Yeah. Lenin. What a remarkably serious, scientific, and Marxist analysis. Kautsky has splendidly rectified unreasonable history. He has proved that there was no need for the British to have taken Egypt from the French, that it was absolutely not worth the German financiers' while to have started the war, organized the Turkish campaign, and taken other measures to drive the British out of Egypt. All this is merely a misunderstanding. It just hasn't yet dawned upon the British that it would be best to give up forcible methods in Egypt and adopt peaceful democracy so as to increase exports of capital, a la Kautsky. Quote, "Of course it was an illusion on the part of the bourgeois free traders to think that free trade would entirely eliminate the economic antagonisms generated by capitalism. Neither free trade nor democracy can eliminate these. We, in all respects, are interested in having these antagonisms eliminated by a struggle waged in such forms as will impose the least amount of suffering and sacrifice on the masses." Unquote. The Lord help us, the Lord have mercy on us. What is a Philistine? LaSalle used to ask, and answered by quoting the words of the well-known poet, "A Philistine is a gut void of everything but fear and hope that God will have mercy on him."
So we'll end on that note. Please like, share, and subscribe. And don't just watch or listen, practice along with me. See you tomorrow.